My other disclaimer is I am a religious ethicist. We read our papers. I will not be reading a paper because Christian told me I couldn't. So I have pictures to show you. My PowerPoint is not very fancy schmancy. I have an outline, and this is not how we do things in my field. So I apologize in advance, but and I have someone giving me to time me because I write on the money when I read a paper, but I have no idea. So I'll just stop if we run out of time. Or maybe I'll talk fast and we'll have lots of time to talk. So, okay, you have the outline in front of you as well, so you know what I'm going to do here. So let me just give you a little introduction to this project, because I think there's some disciplinary differences among, well, everyone here, of course, and among myself in particular from other people. So I'm really a comparative religious ethicist. So I'm trained in religious studies, both in ethics, so with a philosophical background, as well as area studies. So I work in Christianity. Hey, Jessica. Jessica was at the other session, I was just saying. Linda's session was packed, Jessica, while we were over there in your fancy room. The last session here. So you have the same sort of turnout than I did. Or I have a student chart you do. Okay, so that's where I'm coming to my research as. I usually work within two traditions. And even when I work within one tradition, I always think about comparison as my sort of central methodology. So this is really intra-tradition comparison. I have 3 field sites. I work kind of like an anthropologist, and then I go places, I interview people, I do focus groups. I also do textual analysis. So this is thoroughly comparative as far as I'm concerned, although it's only in Islam. I'm going to be okay, and so the sort of thing to know about religious ethicists and comparativists is that we take theology and theological claims very seriously, just as much as a philosopher would take a truth claim, like truth with a capital T. I don't work confessionally in my own work, so I'm not presenting my own Islamic ethics of modesty, but I'm taking the claims about that by the people I'm talking to very seriously. That's kind of what makes this theological. The other thing that comparativists do in religious ethics is we tend to sort of, even though some of us work on Christianity, we tend to really sort of question some of the centering of Christianity and virtue ethics that gets done. And so that's kind of a little bit where I'm coming from. This project is part of the Character of Theology project is part of a bigger book project called Pious Fashion. And it's inspired out of some fieldwork I was doing in Tehran in 2004. This is not Tehran, but is this going to work for me? Oh, okay. This is Indonesia. I'm going to talk about Indonesia today. But something like this kind of inspired the project. So I was doing fieldwork on something totally different in Iran. Had to veil myself because that's the law when you're in Tehran. Sort of didn't like veiling, sort of thought it was this non-issue. Not an interesting issue anyway in terms of ethics, like just people shouldn't do it. And myself got interested in veiling fashion as sort of an escape from everything else I was doing, as well as some of the political work that was being done around in a country where compulsory veiling, you have to veil, and yet there's a way in which certain types of veiling was doing really important theological work and reforming Sharia law and things like that. And so I sort of thought, okay, let's think about how that work might be different in different cultural contexts, different visual contexts, different political contexts. And so I came up with 3 case studies. And the important thing about these case studies is they're all Muslim majority contexts, and that's important because part of what I look at is visual culture, and so it's important that something gets read within a context in which people are assuming sort of this Islamic visual culture. So the 3 sites are Tehran, Iran, Istanbul, Turkey, and then Jakarta, Indonesia, or Jogja, which I'm going to be talking about today, because I thought I would give you one little piece of the puzzle today. Then there's sort of background might be helpful to know is that in Islam, so do I have anybody here who works in Islam at all? Not really, okay. So in Islam, those of you who know sort of Greek, especially Aristotelian virtue ethics, Islamic medieval sort of conceptions of virtue ethics are very, very similar. They draw very heavily on the Greeks. They basically do things like, when they quote Aristotle, they change gods to God. Otherwise, it very much follows this idea of habit formation, creating a disposition. The word is malaka in Arabic. So that veiling then becomes something you do to become a certain sort of person. But I thought, okay, there must be something more. Let's look at fashion veiling, one type of veiling that's expensive, trying to follow fashion trends, not necessarily about being unattractive, thinking about issues of, or trying to think about publicly about issues of beauty and aesthetics, and what else is there sort of going on in these contemporary communities. So in general, religious ethicists, or the veil in particular, has been talked about a lot. Ooh, wow, that's really big for me. Okay, has been talked about. This is what I mean. I don't really know how to do PowerPoint. That's huge. Okay. So in general, fashion veiling is veiling is talked about a lot by ethicists, but it's talked about sort of in 3 dimensions: personal, interpersonal, and social. So the personal sort of take would be sort of thing I was talking about, where you like put on the veil and you don't want to, but you do it every day, and it makes you into a modest person. It's a form of process, a process of character formation. Another would be interdisciplinary, or not interpersonal rather, ethics. So about sort of creating or desexualizing interactions between men and women, not preventing illicit sexual things from happening, and then also sort of social dimension. So, for example, Ayatollah Bucar used to talk about in his writings about there being a social dignity that's created in the public space by having all the women to veil. So there being a social dimension. But I wanted to think about, in this project, if I sort of focus on aesthetics and fashion, how those 3 kind of questions of personal, interpersonal, and social, I could kind of generate some new questions to look at about veiling. And so that's sort of what this slide's trying to do. So this is the kind of things I'm looking at. So what happens socially, the power of veiling when it suddenly becomes in vogue. That's like once you start to think about fashion, the fact that it's more fashionable to wear a veil in Indonesia than it is to not wear a veil. And so you have girls wearing a veil on Friday night to go on a date or for coffee, but not on Monday morning to go to school. Like, what does that mean about the veil socially? Can a woman embody the virtue of modesty when her intent is to wear a style that flatters her? So that's, this next, I'm going to show you a picture of it. And also, can certain forms of Islamic modest dress actually increase a woman's physical attractiveness to others? This next slides are actually from a photographer who's based in Tehran, and she did this great sort of series of like about 20 different women where she showed before and after, just sort of to show the visual production of veiling and how women, because I think particularly if you grow up in the West, you grow up in a non-Muslim community, you think that veiling is this thing that hides women's beauty. And so all these are sort of cases of women who feel, and again, these are women who have to veil. They're not necessarily women who would veil otherwise, but sort of the beauty that's sort of involved, or the beauty that's created through veiling. And this is the kind of veiling I'm talking about with, makeup is involved, colors are involved, sometimes brand names are involved, and that's all part of their style and their intent. Okay, but again, Iran's kind of a different special case. I'm happy to talk about it more in Q&A because it is required. So I thought it'd be better to look at something like Indonesia where it's really a choice. Okay, so let me get out of these beautiful fashionistas. But there's a lot we could just talk about just here in terms of the relationship between virtue and aesthetics and ethics and aesthetics. And so what do you see and what do you read and what are they trying to convey? Okay, so fashion veiling among college students in Jogja, Indonesia. So first it's important to sort of set the local veiling context. I think most people know that Indonesia is a majority Muslim country, but veiling is not a traditional practice in Indonesia, like at all. It's not really even common to the last 10 years. It's been politically jockeyed over where you had it sort of banned under Suharto, and then you had it sort of like encouraged that some universities you couldn't go to without wearing the veil. But basically, it's in most parts, and particularly in Central Java, it's basically your choice. And what's happening is most Muslim women in college decide to take up the veil. And that means they're doing so when their mothers don't veil, even now, or maybe their mothers didn't veil when they were younger, their grandmothers didn't veil. In fact, just a generation ago, Muslim female peasants would go sort of topless in the fields. It's not really considered, covering women's bodies wasn't considered part of necessary being a pious Muslim. So there's this, oops, my arguments, I didn't tell you my arguments. Well, we'll come back to this. So there's this process in college where girls are basically having to decide how to put on, it's jilbab, they use the Arabic word jilbab, which literally means a cloak, but just means veil, or Islamic dress in Indonesia to translate it sort of. They don't use the word hijab, and they don't use the word like chador or burqa or anything like that. So there's this process of putting on jilbab. The girl on the right there, this is the first week, she was part of my focus group, so this is the first week she was wearing jilbab, so she was sort of like, how do you think I look? Am I doing a good job? I'm trying to figure out like what style flatters me and how to like match the color of my shirt to my, and that's what she's obsessed with this. So these are the kind of questions she had when she decided to put on the veil. And she was sort of like proud of the color combination she made this day. You can kind of see that she's wearing really just like a normal sort of like tunic over something called a menset, which is just a long, tight t-shirt, and with some sort of headscarf. Underneath her headscarf, she's wearing something called a chiput, which is very common in Indonesia, not necessarily in Iran. It's not really used, and it's called something different in Turkey. But that's to keep your hair kind of covered, and it keeps the scarf on. But there's lots of different styles of like sort of how to wear a scarf, what your scarf looks like, how do you pin it, how do you tie it. And so there's this like process of figuring out how a woman, when she decides to veil, particularly because she doesn't have her mother, and usually teach her what she's going to do. How am I doing on time so far? Gee, we're going to be done way before 25 minutes then. Okay, good. So part of, I'm going to go to the Qur'an already. Well, a couple more things I can tell you about what women wear in Indonesia. So there's a book called 60 Ways to Wear a Headscarf, and there's more than 60 different styles. These girls, the girl on the right is wearing a very sort of informal style, but you'll see sort of a lot of like pinning where different parts of the chin and head are covered. And again, this all becomes part of it. Once the decision to publicly veil happens, the question of like what is modest is really still up for grabs. There's not like a consensus of what counts as modest jilbab, particularly with the headscarf. A lot of the focus is on the headscarf. Okay, so what I realized going to Indonesia, and I was there, is it 2 years ago now, I guess? 2 years ago now, was particularly compared to my background in Turkey and Tehran, is that modesty just didn't mean the same thing. So in this picture you see belts. You can't wear a belt in Tehran. You wear a belt in Iran, you're going to get arrested. That's considered a violation because it's showing, the justification in Iran is that showing a woman's like curves. So I was seeing things like, in the tight menset, the same thing. That's showing the outline of a woman's body. That wouldn't fly in Iran. And so I was trying to figure out, so what does modesty mean in Indonesia? There's a sort of universal norm, particularly a lot of discourse about women's modesty and how that's important for subject formation, character formation, but it's obviously meaning different things in different contexts. Part of it has to do with cultural context, but also part of it has to do with what's going on theologically, locally. So one main reason why there's such a big difference is that the sort of directive to veil is based on different Quranic passages which get interpreted as being about veiling. So there's actually 3 verses that get read together. One has to do with basically privacy of the prophet's wives and them going behind a curtain. That gets read together with another one that has really the context of Revelation is about protecting women from being sexually assaulted, so they're covering themselves a certain way to identify as being Muslim or free when they're outside their home. Then that gets read together with this one, which is really the only passage that has to do with sexual modesty in the way that we sort of understand it today. So first of all, you start with the beginning, that you have to read all these passages together to get to anything that looks like a contemporary veil. You have to decide that's on how they're related. But even if you do that, you get to this passage, and it's not really clear what it means. So I'm going to stand over here so I can read it. So this is, I didn't give you the whole verse, and it starts with the ayah, the verse that comes before it talks about men, and men have to be modest. Basically it just says men should lower their gaze also. And then there's this stuff about women. Okay, to say the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and their adornments, and the word zina is important, we'll come back to that, except what they must ordinarily appear thereof, and that they should draw their veils, and the word here is actually a handkerchief, kumar is best translation is a handkerchief, over their bosoms, and not display their beauty, again, zina, except for their husbands, their fathers, and the whole list of people you're allowed to be unveiled in front of. But the question comes back to what is meant by zina here. What are we covering? What is the beauty that we're covering? It's clear when we talk about, this passage it's interpreted in medieval exegesis and also medieval Islamic jurisprudence as sort of the grounding for the directive to be modest. And zina itself in Islamic jurisprudence and fiqh has a very particular meaning of sort of illicit, naughty sexual behavior that you can't do. But in the Qur'an, it doesn't have that meaning. So if you really just look at the Qur'an, it's mentioned 43 other times in the Qur'an. And it just talks about attractiveness and beauty. So sometimes it's about people, sometimes it's about the heavens, the skies. And so we don't have that many clues from this text itself what zina means. And that's why we actually end up with this really sort of very diverse interpretation of what it really means. What are we covering? What do we want women to cover? So we have everything from sort of medieval, sort of some fingers sort of saying you cover everything of a woman. All of her is this beauty. All of a woman is beauty. So basically that's that justification for covering everything except for maybe, eyes and hands, and you really have to cover all of her beauty, to everything from that to the other extreme being that, well, it's only about, the mandate is very sort of minor, and it's only about not being sort of flashy or not doing something that would draw extra attention. So in Indonesia, zina is getting basically interpreted to cover the skin. So on the right, that is a poster basically that's up at an Islamic university, like what not to wear or what to wear. So I didn't show, there you see there's girls and boys. This is the what to wear, the side panel you can't see is what not to wear. But a lot of in here on this university, it's being, woans are obviously okay. You see different styles of skirt. The women are, but covered to their ankles and covered to their wrists. And this would be considered a particularly conservative. Again, it's an Islamic-based university, so that dress code is a little bit more conservative. But leggings, this is on the same campus on the left, leggings were worn all the time. And you can't, leggings with just a shirt like this, would not be seen as wearing proper hijab in a place like Indonesia, in a place like Turkey or in Iran. Very, very common, especially among young girls. So basically, it's about covering the skin, and face veil is really, really uncommon in Indonesia. It gets read as an Arab sort of import, a Gulf import. In fact, most Indonesians think that all Iranians wear chador. They think that they cover their entire bodies all the time, and so they see, this is what they're considered to be more sort of modest. This is in the realm of what's considered modest. All right, good. Okay, so the question is, when you're a girl trying to figure out what to wear, what do you do? So this is where we get to this idea of a veil that flatters. This is, in Arabic or in sort of Islamic studies, we sort of call this adab literature. This is basically advice literature. It's a whole sort of 4 or 5 shelves of it in a pretty, sorry, I just messed up his mic probably, a pretty big bookstore in sort of central Jogja, which all the different, so this book I'm going to quote you from this book, for example, and they're just like pictures of like how to wear and how to decide what to wear. So this kind of starts like, so you decide to wear the veil. Here's the practical advice that you need. Mostly written by women for women. And a lot of them will spend 80, 90, 95% of the time on the headscarf. That's a big thing that everyone kind of worries about. You'll often see girls wearing sleeves kind of like mine with very elaborate headscarves. The concern is not so much with showing skin, and in fact, Indonesians, even who aren't covering for pious reasons, cover their skin because of the sun. So the issue is really how do we cover our hair. Okay. Within this advice literature, you have advice about what to do with different types of head shapes. So again, this advice literature will start with like, how many scarves should you buy? What do you need in your head scarf sort of drawer? How many pins do you need? Things like that. And then it gets very quickly from sort of the practical to how do you wear it so that you look both beautiful and modest? How do you wear the right style for you? How do you maintain a modest and flattering style? So this is in Indonesian, so obviously you can't read it, but I'm going to translate part of it for you. These are different face shapes. So on the page before, this is the oval. You see the wajah or oval. That's like the ideal shape. You wear that. If you have that, you're awesome. You can wear anything you want to. If you're unfortunate to have a face shape like me, which is square or round, then there's this advice underneath it, and I've translated it for you. Next to it. So this is for me. Avoid wearing headscarves with base layers that cover the forehead because they'll give the impression that the face is shorter. Avoid wearing headscarf in a style that's pinned to the back of your neck because it'll emphasize the chin and the jaw. It's better to wear a visor chiput, so that's that sort of skull cap which has literally a visor built into it, because it covers the ears, so it'll give the impression that the face is longer and oval. So, and you actually have very similar things in, there's not the same advice literature in Turkey, but I just got back from Turkey, so I have Turkey on the brain. There's a couple fashion magazines, and when I was there, I was reading articles that talk about body type. So there the concern is if you're an apple or a pear or a celeriac root, which is what they use for sort of straight. What do you how do you shape your body type when you're trying to wear? And all this is about flattering you and being beautiful as you do this. And this is one of my favorite examples of a piece of clothing that really has its only function to flatter you. That's a chiput. That's what it looks like that you wear. But this is a special one. This is a bun chiput. So a chiput just looks like a skull cap that you would wear. This one is a bun chaput. You see that little thing in the back? Do you know what that's for? Correct, the illusion of buns. This woman is wearing one. She has like she has short hair like Jessica does, right? And so she does that because it's, in her words, it creates something more interesting to look at. In her family, her father is part of the ulama. She comes from a very religious family. Otherwise, all her skin is covered, but she never goes out of the house without a chaput with a bun on the back of it. And in Iran, you buy fake scrunchies made of hair, do the same kind of thing. And in Turkey, there are the bonnets have big, gigantic beehive bouffants. This whole idea of balancing out the head somehow and the aesthetics being important to the veiling. Okay, so in the time remaining, 8 minutes, I'm gonna give you a couple takeaways for this, for trying to give you some takeaways for theology of character in general, that I think that the sort of this play with fashion and the sort of debates and the sort of practice of fashion in these different contexts are sort of help us think about in terms of virtue ethics and religion in general. So I'm calling them redefining virtue, communication of character, and critique of virtue. Okay, so one thing that's going on in both the adab and the advice literature and the way that women talk about it, so this is not just in the advice literature, this is the way these 20-year-olds are talking about it, is this talk about inner and outer beauty. So this is a quote from another piece of the advice literature. I think this is from, 60 Common Veiling Mistakes, the one I showed you in the bookstore, that white and blue. So there are two sources of women's attractiveness and beauty, namely the physical beauty and the inner beauty, or the beauty that comes from the inside. The outer beauty can be seen in the face, the manner of dress, and the body, while the inner beauty can be seen in the way she behaves, talks, and also her polite, soft, and proper words. So this inner beauty is what we classically think about as virtue, right? And it's important character. But as women are talking about modesty, these two things are not unconnected. You're not a pious Muslim, you're not virtuous if you just have outer beauty. But there's a way in which the two are being really closely connected in both the way that women are thinking about their veiling and the way people are talking about it. So that if you are doing a good job at veiling, it makes your inner beauty show more. Or people really admire, particularly these young women who are figuring out how to veil, they really admire someone they see. Like those women back in the beginning who are from, go back from us, I guess. They're in a pretty ritzy mall in Indonesia, but the young women really admire these women who may or may not be particularly pious, but are obviously very well put together. That there's something about that beauty which is resonating with people as having a good character behind it, as showing a good character. And this is partly tied, in Islam to sort of ideas of clean and cleanliness, but it's also really tied to sort of an older idea of importance of beauty that's sort of been lost. So I'm not allowed to talk about Kant because Christian told us not to talk about Kant, anybody who works in philosophy, but as a joke last time. But in Islam, you can see sort of this in Al-Ghazali, sort of there's this idea that, and this isn't just metaphorical, but this interior luminescence that illuminates the exterior by giving ornation, luster, that in whose heart is not a niche of divine lights, the beauty of prophetic example will not radiate. Al-Ghazali, for those of you who don't know, is like the Aquinas of Islam. He's a big guy. He's a big sort of synthesizer of many different things, right? So for him, beauty was tied to, sort of what I write in my little outline here, intuitive knowledge that cannot come through normal discursive means. So there's something about being beautiful and making yourself beautiful, which is access to moral knowledge in Al-Ghazali's thought, but also in the way these women are talking about it, that they can't get from the clerics and the ulama, from the Islamic law, from fiqh. There's something about the beauty itself which is important. And I can't develop it here, but I think that this suggests, and in Al-Ghazali, he definitely does suggest there's some kind of moral theory or moral epistemology that's grounded on human aesthetic experience and human aesthetic appreciation instead of sort of rational capabilities. So for Al-Ghazali, this is really tied to mysticism and Sufism, but there is definitely a strong strand in Islamic thought for sort of picking, so not only sort of a rationality as sort of the basis for morality, but also this sort of experiential, and particularly this aesthetic and this visual and this beauty experience. So that's one sort of thing. I think that there's a way in which these women are redefining what counts as virtue, so that physical beauty is actually becoming a virtue and not just sort of in a superficial physical way. And it may help us to rethink in different cultural contexts the way in which a virtue which is assumed to be sort of universal is getting played out in different ways. Another thing, so the second thing I wanted to talk about was communication of character, so the way in which the Hijabi Fashionista makes virtue visible in a really important way. So one of the justifications you hear a lot from people is that, yes, marketing to women, that's why they're wearing these outfits, but these Islamic fashion houses are doing this because it makes Islam literally more attractive. So if you see someone who is doing hijab with a maxi dress from H&M or with a Louis Vuitton scarf, and that's sort of what's in vogue, it makes it seem easier for you to sort of segue into being someone who's veiled, and it's kind of like the gateway drug for being sort of the good pious Muslim. Like you kind of get these girls, capture these girls at a point when fashion is important. So that's part of it, but the other part of it is that it's really a way, and this is sort of a combination of ethics and visual culture. It's a way in which abstract ideas and morals and virtues can get worked out in a concrete way. So one thing that this picture sort of shows, and actually I'm cheating, this is a picture from Turkey, because I couldn't find anything quite so. These Louis Vuitton is harder to find in Central Java. You can find it in Jakarta, but it's harder to find in Central Java. But you find it everywhere in Istanbul. And part of what this, I want to show you this image is trying to convey is that because it's visual, there's a way in which different tensions can kind of be held together. So obviously this is sort of this Western idea of fashion, but this veiling practice is happening in a very a mostly Muslim neighborhood, a very unsecular neighborhood in Istanbul, which is actually very unusual. In Indonesia, you'll see that the girl who's wearing leggings, also wearing a batik top, also wearing sort of the headscarf. So there's this combination of leggings, which have become really in vogue in sort of Western global fashion, with batik, and there's this whole production of cloth in Indonesia. So Indonesians have really fought for batik being their national fabric, and that's being incorporated into a lot of different veiling fashion. Schoolgirls' uniforms are based on batik a lot. And then the headscarf, and the way in which these different identities and different sort of pressures that are on her, you kind of see visually manifested. So it gives you a lot of interesting things to think about as an ethicist. And then I think probably the most exciting is sort of the way in which these fashionistas, which I know it sounds like a really silly thing to have in a paper, that there's a way in which there's a real strong critique of moral norms going on, which are very context specific. So the critique that's going on in Iran is very different than the critique going on in Turkey, which is very different than the critique going on in Indonesia. It's sort of this, if those of you who like Bourdieu, it's sort of his idea of a permanent revolution, because you're always both sort of playing into what the norm, the status quo of visual culture is, but each time you put on your outfit, there's an opportunity to sort of innovate and challenge. And when you're doing it with something like Islamic dress, religious dress, there's a way in which you can, or every time you do, put on your own sort of decision on what counts as that. You're challenging doctrine and authority, and also specific teachings about what counts as modesty and what modesty really is. Is it really about covering women's shape? Is it really about not standing out, not being attractive? Because that's not what it seems to be really in Indonesia. It seems to be a whole other sort of collection of norms. And so in Indonesia, this is a quote from one of the popular Indonesian fashion bloggers. And so this is an example of one of the critiques that she thinks the jilbab fashion's making. It's that she thinks it's attracting this younger generation who want to protest the image of Anglo beauty in media and TV. So wearing hijab, we're free. She publishes on her blog in English as well. So she's trying to sort of bring the revolution outside of Indonesia by showing these sort of local, particularly not only Indonesian but Malaysian forms of jilbab. And of course, the other thing that's really important, which I don't have a slide to show you about, but is how in a lot of Islamic ethics, most of the production of knowledge and norms and directives and what counts as virtue is being done by the clerical elite, by the ulama, by the man. And so this is one place where, again, this vice literature is often, most of the time, written by women for women, and it's one place where you really see production of what counts as virtue and moral knowledge really happening at sort of the ground up, and also from women instead of just from men. Okay, how was that for time? Okay. Whoa. I'm always going to talk off an outline. Sure.
I was wondering if you could say something about the relationship between beauty and virtue in Iran. I don't know much about it, but so I always hear these stories of the Modesty police come and harass women, and women resist this. They don't, you know, for some, they're wearing some accessory or some belt or something, and so there you might, is there like a contrast there between the sort of the beauty they're trying to exemplify and sort of the virtue that maybe the state's trying to impose or something?
Yeah, so Iran's a really different case. So all three of these cases are really different in terms of the political context, right? So in Iran, not since the revolution, but since '83, since a couple years after the revolution, it's required that all women wear Islamic dress, which is undefined. And if you look back at some fatwas by like Khomeini, even he leaves it undefined. It's sort of talking about, you don't have to wear chador, you wear, it's up to your choice. But then we have a bunch of fatwas and sort of different clerics have their own opinion about what you have to wear. What it means is that you have a whole hosh-posh of what you can wear by the law. You have to sort of figure out for yourself what counts. In the penal, there is a penal law about this. So in the law, you can, if you're wearing improper hijab, you can be arrested, a month in prison, 74 lashes, a fine, like $50 or something. People don't get lashed for wearing improper hijab. People actually don't even get arrested for a month. What happens is, like you're saying, the moral police go around and sort of pick up a bunch of women who are wearing sleeves that are too short, or wearing lime green, or who are wearing belts, or too much makeup, or too much poofy hair. And they round them up and they kind of harass them, and they get to the newspaper, and then people sort of button it up, literally, for a couple weeks or a couple months. It always happens this summer because it's so freaking hot. So people start to unbutton and start to, you know. But so they're the sort of the critique. So the way in which the aesthetics and ethics interact a little differently. So the critique that's happening, for example, is that, and this is actually what originally inspired the project, is that you have like slutty hijabi more, basically. So you have, particularly among young girls, you have these girls who don't want to be wearing hijab. They have to wear hijab. They're trying to wear like Joan Jett hijab. They're trying to wear uber sexy hijab. And I mean in public. I don't mean like behind doors where they can do what they want to do. And what's happened with that, and so, slutty hijab, that's not my phrase, it's a phrase that my friends use when I was in Tehran, and we saw someone like, oh, check out her slutty hijab, and I was like, what do you mean? Like, and so for them, and they were reading someone who was wearing jeans, they were kind of like capri jeans, her manteau, which they call the shirt there, was kind of a little bit gauzy, kind of short. She had a scarf that was folded, so her back hair and her front hair showed up. She had lots of makeup on. They described to me what was going on. There are all these things that they thought was slutty about her job. And I like look at my friends, I look at this woman, and my friends, all their ankles are showing, they all have mascara. So Tehran's the only place I've ever done field work where I had to like email like my mom and say, send me more makeup, because like I'm not wearing enough makeup for this, like people aren't taking me seriously. They're all like, all their hair is showing. So the takeaway from that is that what had been considered moderate was really shifting because of this sort of slutty hijab. And the same thing has happened with colors. You used to have to be aware of red or pink or bright colors. When I was there, lime green, I mean, no joke, lime green was the rage. Everyone was wearing lime green, the brightest lime green aqua you could wear. And so there's ways in which the fashion is sort of, the letter of the law is the same, but it's really reforming what's getting enforced. So it's this huge reformation of Sharia law, which technically the Iranian government would say is impossible, but it's actually happening. So you have to, so for me to answer your question, Iran, it's a big backstory, but yeah, there are different issues at stake there.
I wonder, you mentioned briefly in Indonesia about this intergenerational thing. Mm-hmm. So about how it's something novel, and does that have what are the ramifications for that in terms of I guess I don't know if this does end up having ramifications for the virtue question, but ramifications for human relationships in the family. Do parents resist children?
Sometimes they do. Sometimes they're really happy their daughter has chosen. So the woman wearing the bun shaput, for example, she always knew she was going to wear jilbab of some sort because she comes from a very religious family. Her mother is actually one of the exceptions. Her mother did veil. But you have, you sort of have the spectrum. So you have some mothers really kind of disappointed that their girls are wearing jilbab because to them that was never a marker of piety. And of course, it's not a marker of piety now. Like I wasn't joking about the girls who wear it on Friday night because it goes better with their outfit. And there's so much attention to the fashion of it and making it cool now that girls will kind of try it out. So there are mothers who really, don't like this. And of course, within families, you have this generational sort of like, well, grandma, who like not only covers but like is not modest at all. The daughter sort of. And there's also concern with sort of radical Islamization too. Like, is this an import? Are these girls now veiling because of, this global Islamic movement? Are we going to become like, the Gulf? That's kind of the big concern for them.
If I can follow up, I'll come back to this time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just going to ask you a question about how it's not even more relevant perhaps to Turkey and Iran from what you're saying. But what I find interesting about at least the full shador and the hijab too, is that it's based on the perception of women's bodies as highly sexual, right? That you have to cover it because women's bodies are so provocative to have. That seems at least part of it.
That's definitely a different justification in Iran, for sure. That's part of the official justification in Iran.
So I was
for sure,
sort of curious about this tying of, the virtue of modesty is tied to this very specific, highly sexual, immodest perception of women's body.
Right. Okay. So that's actually helpful. So it's helpful to parse out beauty from sexualization of women's bodies, and attractiveness from trying to be sexy.
Yeah.
So none of these women in Indonesia or so I'm saying Turkey because again, there's more fluidity it's more fluid what you can wear, and also it used to be that you really discriminated against if you didn't wear it. That's changed in this last sort of presidency, and now it's again there's this whole ruling elite that has a lot of money and are Muslim and are trying out fashion and wearing Louis Vuitton and stuff. But in the Vice literature, for example, there's no talk of attracting your husband this way. And in fact, when I kind of push women on that, are you doing this in part is this going to get you? Are you more likely to get married? I mean, I'm trying to figure out why they're starting to do it in college, and part of it seems to be a lot more peer pressure than are you doing this to get a Muslim man to show you're pious? That's a little bit of it, but they're not seeing themselves as making themselves more sexy. They're again, and the veiling style. So much attention in the Indonesian literature about flattering your face is about making your face more beautiful, symmetrical, pleasing to the eye. And even the bun, I don't know which guy, who thinks a fake bun is sexy? Not very many men that I know. Fake hair, not particularly sexy, but is that more attractive, more aesthetically appealing? The Turkish fashion magazines, and this is new. In the last couple of years, there's one that has really high production value. It looks better than Vogue. It has a pretty high circulation, but it's not. It's being supported by. I'm pretty sure by some higher ups in the leadership. But anyway, in those magazines, I think a more complicated question is why should you dress for your body shape? And again, the women will say the same thing. It just makes common sense. If you have a big butt, you want to cover your big butt, just like you want to cover your big butt, Liz. It's nothing to do with being Muslim or not Muslim. But when you start talking about those articles are really about emphasizing a small waist, making your hips look smaller. And that doesn't necessarily have to be sexualized. When you start talking about the body, it seems more sexual to me, right, than the face. But they're not talking about it in sexual terms. They're talking about it in terms of symmetry. And again, there's an ideal of beauty there, but it's not necessarily geared towards attracting men.
I was sort of interested in how they negotiate the fact that the public perception of the hijab and the whole justification for it to begin with is because of this conception of what it is so provocative.
Yeah, it creates too much social disorder.
Yeah, I was wondering how the women negotiate that.
I mean, some of them agree with that.
Okay.
I mean, men are dogs, and so part of what this is to create a sanitized asexual environment so I can be taken seriously. If anybody's actually veiled before, I mean, so I always tell my students the personal anecdote of spending, the summer in Tehran and going to Turkey, where I don't veil in Turkey because it would be weird for me to be veiled in Turkey as a non-Muslim. I have to veil in Tehran. And when I come between those two situations, I don't like it that men touch my hand when they give me change. I don't like it that men sit next to me on the bus. I'm used to something, and it does sort of change me in a certain way. And and men are dogs. But anyway, so yeah, so there's I think there's some acceptance of that. But there's also this idea that your idea that because our idea is well, you're Australian, but American women's idea that we're wearing this because men are in control and it's patriarchy and we're being forced to. It's actually we're wearing this to create ourselves into a certain sort of Muslim pious subject. It's just like praying. We remember certain things by doing this, and it's not it's not about women's bodies or not. And actually, men should actually if you go back and look at that verse, the ayah before is about men being modest in their behavior as well. And there are certain modesty norms. So in Indonesia, men wear petite short sleeve shirts. That's considered formal attire for men with slacks, and that's considered modest and formal. And a lot of the male norms about dress have to do with not looking Western, actually, not looking European, more than covering their naughty bits.
I wanted to ask you how you were seeing the issue that you raised about, what is zina? What is the zina that has to be covered?
Mm-hmm.
And the quote that you had from Al-Ghazali. So I guess I thought, but I could have misunderstood this, I thought that you were thinking that these were in some tension with one another, or that these were two different sources of, well, there were different sources, but that they were sort of opposed to one another or something. And I guess I wasn't really following that thought.
Was it
It seemed to
Al-Ghazali?
me, well, it just seemed to me that if you say, well, there's something that you have to cover that's beautiful, it's not going to be the beauty of the virtue that is manifested in your physical appearance. I mean, it doesn't seem likely that that's what you would have to cover, right? So the issue is around
Right. So
what in your physical appearance conveys that kind of beauty as the thing you're supposed to cover, right?
Yeah, so I mean, so the one thing is the modesty, the verse in the Qur'an. I actually meant to separate these two things, the Ghazali and the zina issue. I mean, I think the zina issue, so, okay, most of the time when this gets translated, so I'm using here the most common English translation in the US, for example, right? So I'm putting in the Arabic back in, but most American Muslims wouldn't know what the Arabic there is. So this idea of not, there is, so it seems from the outside that there is tension from women talking about being beautiful and attractive with, if you just read sort of this covering their beauty and adornments. And that's partly, so it's partly to do with, if you ask women why, it has to do partly with literacy. So Quranic literacy is pretty high in these places, but it's not that high. So if you ask an Indonesian woman why she veils, because the Quran says so, where does it say so? Maybe they'll give you one of these passages, two of these passages, but they're understanding what zina, what the beauty, there's no like debate for them. It's about covering to be modest for them. They're not so concerned with these minutiae of what beauty is, what adornments is. So partly I'm getting from them what I'm seeing from them. Like they're not engaged in exegesis of the Quran. And in fact, that's kind of across the board. Everyone, Indonesia, I mean, again, I just got back from Turkey, same thing. Like, well, why do Muslim women have to, I like play the ignorant, I don't know, why do Muslim women have to veil? Like, I'm an American researcher, tell me. And they'll go, because the Quran says so. Like, well, where does the Quran say so? Like, there's not a lot of reinterpretation or exegesis around the Quran or Hadith. This is just kind of assumed. The Al-Ghazali I meant to be sort of a different issue. Where's the Al-Ghazali? What do I do with him? So I only sort of point this, that this idea of beauty being somehow tied to virtue, which is not necessarily discussed, so it's discussed in this like adab literature that the women are writing, but it's not really discussed in a lot, like in fiqh and in the Islamic jurisprudence. It's not really a major sort of, there's not a lot of discussion of beauty around Islamic ethics, say, let's put it that way. But it's a very old concept. You see it a lot in different classical thinkers. I mean, he's not the only one. And so he's someone who happens to talk both about virtue and beauty, virtue and aesthetics, and combine them. There's a couple others. So it's a way in which these women, they don't know they're doing this. They don't know this passage, right? But it's a recuperating of an older, more classical idea of, we sort of have artificially, I think, taken apart aesthetics and ethics, and that they existed in more,
Okay, so I wanted to suggest a parallel to this, which I think might be really interesting to you. So Nancy Sherman wrote a book called Stoic Warriors.
Okay.
And it's based on the time she was at, I guess, the Naval Academy teaching. Oh. And so she was very interested in the military's idea that your demeanor, your conduct, the way you dress, all of this stuff is actually revealing your character all the time.
That would be helpful.
And so you might find that an interesting parallel.
That would be helpful to have, I think.
There's also, I think, a recent paper I read, which I can't remember the name, the author, or the title, but I can find it.
It's very well.
It's this exact thing about the recent divide. There used to be a strong link between character and your physical appearance.
Yeah.
But the language of that has turned up again in plastic surgery, advertisements and literature, which is about making your face reflect the person you are.
Yeah.
So being a harmony between your physical appearance and your face. So there's actually, I'll find it.
Okay, great.
Because it was actually this idea.
And Sharon, what's the first name of the Sharon?
Nancy
Nancy
Stoic Warriors.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Peter Goldie has a brief discussion like that in his short work on personality.
Okay, great.
Oh,
On
it
your
wasn't,
appearance.
I had that book, but that wasn't the one I was thinking of. Yeah, but this is not specifically about the kind of split between character and physical appearance, which is really the last couple of years.
Yes.
How we
Maybe I'll just bring this session to a formal close and of course we can continue afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.